For 1,000 years, this was the sound of undisputed power. It was the sound of the world ending. Imagine yourself a peasant foot soldier in the year 1450. You are standing in a muddy field in France, holding a sharpened pike that feels like a toothpick. You have a leather cap, maybe a steel helmet if you're lucky. You haven't eaten a hot meal in 3 days, and then you hear it. First, a rumble on the horizon, a vibration in the soles of your feet. Then, a line of steel emerges from the morning mist. They are not men, not really. They are giants clad in sculpted, polished steel, reflections of the sky glinting off their armor. They are mounted on destriers, war horses bred for one purpose, to be living battering rams. Each man is a fortress, a lifetime of training, a fortune in equipment, all focused into the point of a 12-foot lance. They are the knights, the gendarme, the apex predator of the medieval battlefield. When they move, the ground shakes. When they charge, armies break. They are the tank, the shock trooper, and the symbol of an entire social order all in one. To resist them is not just futile, it is unthinkable. Your line of peasant spearmen will shatter. You will be ridden down, lanced through, or crushed under the hooves of a 1-ton war horse. This is the law of the battlefield. It has been this way for centuries. The armored knight is king. Now jump forward just 300 years. The 1750s, the Battle of Leuthen. The field is choked with gunpowder smoke. Thousands of men in bright coats stand in rigid lines, firing volleys of lead at each other. Cannons tear bloody lanes through their formations. And the cavalry? They are still there, but they are different. They wear a polished breastplate called a cuirass, but their limbs are exposed. They carry sabers, not lances. They no longer charge into the center of the unbroken line. Their job is to wait on the flanks, to chase routing enemies, to scout. They are fast, they are deadly, but they are no longer the kings. The man who is king is the man you barely noticed, the common infantryman, the man with the musket. So what happened? How did this become this? And how did he become this? This is the story of how the most dominant weapon system in human history was rendered obsolete. But it wasn't an assassination. It was a slow, agonizing 500-year death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't one invention that killed the knight. It was a painful, grinding revolution in technology, tactics, and, most importantly, society. The knight wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of a world order. He was the militant arm of the aristocracy. He ruled the battlefield because his class ruled the world. To kill the knight, you didn't just need a new weapon. You had to invent a new world. This is the story of how a noisy, inaccurate, and unreliable tube of metal, the gun, did what no emperor, king, or rebel army could. It broke the feudal system. It toppled the aristocracy from their war horses. This is the secret of gunpowder. Before we even discuss the gun, we must understand why the knight was king. His power was not just military, it was economic. A knight was a class. To be a knight in the 15th century didn't just mean you were brave, it meant you were rich. Let's break down the cost. First, the armor. We're not talking about a simple mail shirt. We mean a full suit of articulated Milanese or Gothic plate armor. This was the Formula One car of its day. Custom-fitted, flawlessly engineered, a masterpiece of metallurgy. Its cost was equivalent to a luxury car or a small house today. It could equal the price of an entire village. Second, the horse. A knight didn't ride a farm horse. He rode a destrier, a war horse bred and trained for 10 to 15 years. It was a massive, powerful, and astronomically expensive animal, trained to charge, bite, and kick. A knight needed at least 3 such horses, one for war, one for travel, a palfrey, and one for carrying his baggage, a rouncey. The cost of his war horse alone could exceed the annual income of a dozen farming families. Third, the entourage. A knight never rode alone. He was the head of a lance, a small fire team that included a squire, a knight in training, a page, several men at arms, and archers. He had to pay for their wages, their food, and their equipment. This entire system was funded by the feudal contract. The king or a high lord granted the knight land, a fief, and in exchange the knight owed military service. The knight in turn ruled over the peasants on that land, who owed him their labor, their crops, and their lives. The knight ruled the battlefield because he was the only one who could afford to be on it. His power was a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was the 1%, armed with the medieval equivalent of a stealth bomber. This system was already straining by the 1400s. It was too expensive, too cumbersome. Kings were already preferring to hire professional mercenaries, condottieri, rather than call up their unreliable, arrogant, and massively expensive feudal lords. The age of the knight was already sick. Gunpowder was about to become the plague. The first guns to appear in Europe in the 1300s were unimpressive. They were crude cannons, often just iron tubes hooped together, more likely to explode and kill their own crews than to frighten an enemy. When they did work, they lobbed stone balls that bounced harmlessly off castle walls. Knights and nobles laughed at them. They were dirty, common, and unreliable. A good trebuchet was more effective. A longbow was infinitely deadlier. The first hand cannons, or guns, were just small barrels mounted on a stick. You held it under your arm, pointed it in the general direction of the enemy, and touched a hot wire to a fuse hole. It was slow. It was wildly inaccurate. In damp weather, it was useless. A knight in full plate armor, hearing one of these handguns fire, would have felt nothing but contempt. His armor could easily deflect its weak projectile. He could ride down 100 of these gunners before they had a chance to reload. For the first century of its existence, gunpowder was a novelty, a loud, smoky sideshow. And then, in Bohemia, one man figured out what to do with it. His name was Jan Žižka. He was a one-eyed Czech general, a minor noble who led a rebellion of religious reformers known as the Hussites. He was facing the finest, wealthiest, and most heavily armored knights in all of Christendom, the crusading armies of the Holy Roman Empire. By all medieval logic, Žižka's armies should have been annihilated. They were mostly peasants, artisans, and religious zealots. They had no knights of their own. So Žižka did something brilliant. He didn't try to fight the knights on their terms. He changed the terms of the fight. He invented the Wagenburg, the wagon fortress. He took ordinary farm wagons and armored them with thick wooden planks. He chained them together, wheel to wheel, forming a mobile, circular fortress. On these wagons, he placed his secret weapons, hundreds of those crude hand cannons and small artillery pieces called hufnitze, the origin of the word howitzer. By Armolian Augi should have been annihilated. They were mostly peasants, artisans, and religious zealots. They had no knights of their own. So Žižka did something brilliant. He didn't try to fight the knights on their terms. He changed the terms of the fight. He invented the Wagenburg, the wagon fortress. He took ordinary farm wagons and armored them with thick wooden planks. He chained them together, wheel to wheel, forming a mobile, circular fortress. On these wagons, he placed his secret weapons, hundreds of those crude hand cannons and small artillery pieces called hufnitze, the origin of the word howitzer. When the imperial knights arrived, they saw this circle of peasant carts and scoffed. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution. They formed their lines, they lowered their lances, they charged, and then Žižka gave the order. The effect was not just physical, it was psychological. The knights had never heard such a sound, a wall of thunder, smoke, and lead. Their war horses, brave against steel, panicked at this unnatural explosion. The charge broke apart. Horses reared, throwing their riders. Knights who reached the wagons were pulled down by peasants with long hooked poles and bludgeoned to death on the ground. Again and again the crusaders charged, and again the Wagenburg held, spitting fire and lead. Žižka's peasant army, protected by a wooden wall and armed with primitive guns, had done the impossible. They had stopped the unstoppable. The Hussite wars sent a shockwave through Europe, but it wasn't the one you'd expect. The knight was a shock weapon. His power came from the impact of the charge. His entire purpose was to break an enemy formation in one terrifying, irresistible moment. Gunpowder, even Žižka's crude version, was a missile weapon. It was a tool of attrition. It killed from a distance. The Wagenburg was a defensive tactic. It proved that a disciplined, well-protected force of commoners could negate the knight's charge, but it couldn't replace the knight. The wagons were slow. They couldn't attack. They couldn't take territory. So what did the aristocracy do? Did they abandon their horses and armor? Of course not. They doubled down. Their conclusion wasn't that armor was obsolete. Their conclusion was that their armor wasn't good enough. This kicked off an arms race, but it was an arms race of armor against the gun. For the next 100 years, armorers and blacksmiths became the most valued artisans in the world. They learned to forge steel plates that were thicker, curved and fluted to deflect bullets. This is when we see the birth of the magnificent Gothic plate armor, the Maximilian style. It was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of engineering, and it worked for a while. A knight in proofed armor that had been literally shot with a gun at the forge to prove its strength, could withstand a long-range musket ball. But this created a new problem. The armor became absurdly, cripplingly heavy. A full suit of jousting armor could weigh over 90 pounds, 40 kilograms. Even field plate was 50 or 60 pounds. Knights had to be winched onto their horses with cranes. If they fell, they couldn't get back up. They were no longer agile warriors. They were walking tanks. They had built a perfect defense, but in doing so, they had sacrificed the very mobility that made them a threat. They were stronger than ever and more useless than ever. They were denying a fundamental truth. The problem wasn't the armor. It was the man inside the armor. The knight's entire identity was built on individual prowess, his valor, his strength, his personal skill. Gunpowder didn't care about any of that. Gunpowder was the great social equalizer. It was a commoner's weapon. It took no great strength. It took weeks to train a musketeer, not a lifetime to train a knight. And as the 1500s dawned, a new generation of common soldiers, armed with better guns, was about to meet the walking tanks on the fields of Italy. The result would end the age of chivalry forever. The gun didn't kill the knight alone. It had an accomplice, and that accomplice was a very, very long stick. Meet the Swiss pikeman. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Swiss perfected a tactic that terrified the knights of Austria and Burgundy. They adopted the ancient Macedonian phalanx, but instead of sarissas, they held 18-foot-long pikes. They formed into a dense, bristling square of men, a schiltron, or hedgehog. When a knight charged this moving forest of steel, the result was a massacre. For the horse. The horses would impale themselves on the front rank of pikes, throwing their riders to the ground, where the Swiss would dispatch them with halberds and daggers. The Swiss pikemen became the most feared mercenaries in Europe. They were disciplined, brutal, and they hated knights. For them, it was class warfare. They had a policy of no quarter for armored aristocrats. But the pike hedgehog had a weakness. It was slow, and it was vulnerable to missile fire, especially arrows, and, eventually, bullets. Now we go to Spain. The Spanish, fighting the French in the Italian wars, faced a dilemma. The French gendarmes were the best heavy cavalry in the world. Their charge was still the most feared maneuver in warfare. The Swiss pikemen were the best infantry, but they were mercenaries and expensive. A Spanish general, Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, known as El Gran Capitán, found himself in southern Italy, facing a superior French army. He was outnumbered, and his army was a mix of Spanish infantry, some German Landsknecht mercenaries, and a few cannons. The French, led by the dashing Duke of Nemours, were confident. They had superior numbers and the finest heavy cavalry. De Córdoba was a genius. He was a revolutionary. He didn't believe in the rules of chivalry. He believed in winning. On the 28th of April, 1503, near the town of Cerignola, he built a new kind of defense. He didn't just find good ground, he engineered it.
He ordered his men to dig a deep trench and build a high earthen rampart behind it. On top of this rampart, he placed his arquebuseros, the men with the new matchlock arquebus. Behind them, he placed his bristling squares of German and Spanish pikemen. His cannons were placed on the flanks. It was a fortress, but it was a fortress in the middle of an open field. The French arrived in the late afternoon. The Duke of Nemours looked at the Spanish ditch with contempt. He believed his gendarmes could leap the trench and smash the commoners behind it. The aristocratic arrogance was overwhelming. He ordered a full frontal assault. The French gendarmes charged. It was glorious. They galloped across the field, and then they hit the trench. It was a nightmare. The horses couldn't or wouldn't jump the ditch. The entire charge, the single most powerful weapon in the world, piled up on itself, becoming a confused, tangled mass. And into this mass, de Córdoba's arcabuceros poured a relentless, disciplined, point-blank fire. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The gendarmes were slaughtered. The Duke of Nemours himself was killed, one of the first generals in history to be killed by a common soldier's bullet. The French infantry, seeing their noble leaders annihilated, panicked and fled. Cerignola was the prototype. It was the first time a European army, built around the new model of pike and shot, had decisively, utterly destroyed a classic medieval army built around the knightly charge. De Córdoba had written the blueprint. He had combined commoners' earthworks, commoners' pikes, and commoners' guns into a system that was 100% knight-proof. Now all that was left to prove is that it could work without a ditch.
De Córdoba's innovation evolved. What if the fortress wasn't made of dirt, but of men? This led to the Tercio. It was a fortress of living men. At its heart was a massive square of pikemen. They were the shield of the formation. They were the trench from Cerignola, made mobile. They would stop any cavalry charge cold. But mixed inside this pike square, and in sleeves on its flanks, were soldiers armed with the arquebus. These were the arquebuseros. They were the sword of the formation. This was the genius of the system. The pikemen protected the vulnerable arquebusiers while they reloaded. The arquebusiers, in turn, would step out from the ranks, fire a volley of lead into the enemy, and then step back behind the wall of pikes to reload in safety. It was a perfect symbiosis, a synthesis of pike and shot. It was the first modern combined arms unit. And in 1525, this mature formation would be put to the ultimate test. This is the battle that truly ended the Middle Ages. On one side, the French army, led by King Francis I. He was the romantic ideal of a Renaissance king, chivalrous, brave, and obsessed with the glory of the knightly charge. He commanded the gendarmes, the elite of European heavy cavalry. On the other side, the Spanish imperial army. They were outnumbered, dug in, and composed largely of those common troops, German Landsknecht pikemen and 4,000 Spanish arquebuseros. King Francis saw the enemy, and his aristocratic blood boiled. He saw a chance for eternal glory. His generals begged him to let his artillery bombard the Spanish lines, to wait. Francis refused. The glory of a charge was too much to resist. He personally led the French gendarmes in one of the last great cavalry charges in history.
It was magnificent, it was glorious, and it was a disaster. The French charge was so eager, it actually blocked its own artillery's line of fire. They thundered across the field and crashed, not into a line of peasants, but into the solid, professional wall of 18-foot pikes. The charge stopped dead. The horses were impaled. The knights, in their heavy, expensive armor, were thrown into the mud. The formation dissolved into a chaotic, flailing mass of men and animals.
And then the Spanish commander gave the order. The arcabuceros stepped from behind their pike protection. They leveled their guns at the disorganized, trapped, and now stationary mass of French knights. They couldn't miss. It was a slaughter. The bullets punched through 10,000 ducat armor as if it were parchment. The pride of the French aristocracy was annihilated in minutes, not by other knights, but by low-born Spanish soldiers. King Francis himself was unhorsed. He fought on foot until he was cornered by arcabuceros who, not recognizing him, were about to kill him for his fine armor. An officer had to intervene. The King of France was taken prisoner. Pavia was the nightmare of the aristocracy made real. It proved that a lifetime of chivalric training, a horse worth a village, and armor worth a castle, meant nothing. A common man with a cheap musket and a few weeks of training could kill the noblest blue blood in Europe. The gun wasn't just a weapon, it was an argument. It was a statement of social revolution. The Battle of Pavia was the knight's funeral. The gendarmes were broken, the king was captured, the myth of the invincible aristocratic warrior was shattered and left to rust in a muddy field in Italy. So, let's be clear, the gun did not kill the knight. The combination of pike and shot killed the knight. The discipline of the common soldier killed the knight. The tactics of combined arms killed the knight. The gun was the catalyst. It was the force multiplier. The pike could stop the knight, but it couldn't easily kill him. The gun could kill him, but it couldn't stop him. Together, they were a complete system that made heavy cavalry a suicidal liability. The age of the tank on horseback was over. The question now was, what would the cavalry become? The first thing to go was the lance. The heavy, couched lance charge was the entire point of the night. But if you charge a wall of pikes and muskets, you are simply delivering yourself to the slaughter. So generals stopped investing in it. By the mid-1500s, the lance was increasingly a ceremonial weapon. So, if cavalry couldn't charge in, what could they do? They tried to become a gunpowder unit themselves. This led to one of the most awkward and ineffective tactics in military history, the caracal. A new type of cavalryman emerged, the German Reiter. He was still armored, but he carried a brace of massive wheel-lock pistols. The caracal tactic worked like this. A squadron of Reiters would ride toward an enemy infantry square. The first rank would ride up, fire their pistols, which were wildly inaccurate, and then, this is the key part, they would turn around and ride to the back of their own formation to reload. Then the second rank would ride up, fire, and retreat. Then the third. It was a slow, revolving, equestrian drive-by shooting. It was terrible.
It had zero shock value. It annoyed the infantry more than it hurt them. A disciplined square of musketeers would simply wait for the riders to get close, fire one well-aimed volley, and break the entire formation. The caracal was a sign of desperation. It was cavalry trying to imitate infantry and failing badly. It was an admission of defeat. They had given up shock, their one great advantage, in favor of weak, indecisive firepower. It took a true military genius to figure out what to do with the horse. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. Gustavus, the Lion of the North, reinvented warfare during the 30 Years' War. He looked at the caracal and saw its weakness. He looked at the old knightly charge and saw its obsolescence. He created a new kind of cavalry. First, he lightened them. He kept the breastplate, cuirass, and helmet, but threw away the leg and arm armor. Mobility was key. Second, he rearmed them. He took away their pistols and gave them back their primary weapon, the saber. Third, and most importantly, he changed their mission. Gustavus Adolphus's cavalry was forbidden from using the caracal. They were trained to do one thing: charge. Wait, you say, didn't we just establish that charging is suicide? Ah, but this is the genius of Gustavus. His cavalry did not charge first. Gustavus's entire system was built on aggression. He created a new kind of infantry, smaller, more mobile blocks of musketeers and pikemen. He created light, mobile field artillery that could be moved during the battle. His new doctrine was this: his artillery would blast holes in the enemy line. His infantry would advance, firing devastating, disciplined volleys to shock and break the enemy formation. Then, and only then, would the cavalry be unleashed. His cavalry, now fast and light, would not charge the unbroken pikes. They would charge the gaps. They would smash into the stunned, disorganized, and wavering enemy infantry after the muskets and cannons had done their work. The knight died on the battlefield around 1525, but he died in the public imagination even earlier. By the time King Francis charged at Pavia, the very idea of the knight was already a subject of satire. The world had changed. The Renaissance was in full swing. A new merchant class, built on trade and banking, had more money and more practical sense than the old land-based aristocracy. Chivalry, the knight's code of honor, was now seen as hopelessly naive, impractical, and, frankly, a bit silly. The greatest book of this era, and perhaps of all time, is Don Quixote, published in 1605. It is the story of a minor noble who reads too many chivalric romance novels, loses his mind, and decides to become a knight-errant. He puts on his great-grandfather's rusty suit of armor, mounts a broken-down farm horse, and charges at windmills, which he mistakes for giants. This wasn't just a funny story. It was a brutal satire. Cervantes was telling the world, look at this ideal you once worshipped. It is a madman. It is a joke. It has no place in the modern world. Don Quixote's armor doesn't stop bullets. It's just rusty metal. His quest for glory is just delusional vandalism. This cultural death was just as important as the military one. When a society begins to laugh at its greatest warriors, their time is over. The knight was no longer an apex predator. He was a fossil, an object of romantic, tragic, and comical nostalgia. Through the 1700s and 1800s, this new cavalryman dominated. The hussar, the dragoon, the lancer. They were the romantic image of war. They were dashing, brave, and utterly vital to any army. But look closely. The armor is gone. The 18-foot pike square is gone. The battlefield is now ruled completely and totally by two things: the musket line and the cannon. The cavalryman was just a supporting actor, a crucial one, but he was no longer the star of the show. The star was the common foot soldier, standing in a line, firing in volleys, disciplined and anonymous. The revolution that began at Cerignola and was confirmed at Pavia was complete. The common man had inherited the battlefield. The knight, however, left a ghost of glory. It was the romantic idea that one brave charge could still change the world. And this ghost would haunt generals for another 150 years, long after it should have been exercised. It led to moments of unbelievable, tragic, and useless bravery. It led to the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854, where 600 British light cavalrymen, armed with sabers, charged directly into the teeth of 20 Russian cannons. They were obeying a badly communicated order. They knew it was suicide. They did it anyway, out of a sense of chivalric duty. They were annihilated. It led to the French cuirassiers at Waterloo in 1815, where Marshal Ney, in a fit of desperation, sent 12,000 of the best heavy cavalry in the world in a hopeless charge up a muddy slope against unbroken British infantry squares. For hours they surged around the hedgehogs of bayonets, firing pistols, hacking with sabers, unable to break in. They died in thousands, their horses and armor a testament to a bygone era. Even as late as 1939, the Polish army, in a moment of sheer desperation, launched the charge at Kroyonti, where 2 squadrons of lancers charged a German infantry battalion. They were initially successful, until German armored cars armed with 20mm cannons appeared and cut them to pieces. The lance had met the tank. The story was finally, truly over. The knight in armor was not killed by the gun. He was killed by a system of tactics, discipline, and technology. But more than that, he was killed by a social revolution. The feudal world was built on a pyramid. The knight was at the top, the peasant at the bottom. The knight's power on the battlefield was a direct reflection of his power in society. Gunpowder inverted that pyramid. It democratized warfare. It made the common disciplined infantryman the single most important asset in an army. It proved that a well-trained group of nobodies could defeat the most powerful somebody. The gun was a tool, but the idea it represented was far more powerful. It was the idea that a man's worth was not in his bloodline, his armor, or his personal valor, but in his willingness to stand in a line with his brothers, to hold his nerve, and to fight as one.
The knight was an individual. The musketeer was part of a unit. And in the smoke-choked fields of the modern world, the age of the individual was over. The age of the common soldier, our age, had begun.